Good evening. My name is Annalisa Eng. I am a librarian with our Youth Services Department who works on programming for children and teens. And tonight I have the pleasure of introducing you to our panelists. Leading tonight's conversation is LA County Librarian and Director, Dr. Skye Patrick. Dr. Skye Patrick was appointed to her role in 2016. She's responsible for the library's 86 libraries, 15 vehicle mobile fleet, and resources that are used by more than 3.4 million customers across LA County. From the beginning of her tenure, Skye prioritized community engagement through visioning sessions, inviting the public to share their ideas for local libraries. Her mission has been to break down barriers and expand access by developing programs that meet the needs of LA County's diverse communities. Under Skye's leadership, LA County Library received the 2023 National Medal for Museum and Library Service, the nation's highest honor given to museums and libraries. She is also a recipient of the 2025 James Irvine Leadership Award, which recognizes leaders whose innovative solutions to critical state challenges improve people's lives, create opportunity, and contribute to a better California. Skye remains dedicated to reinforcing the library's role as a hub for information, literacy, civic engagement, learning, and belonging. Tonight, Skye will be speaking with Ash Brandin. Ash Brandin is an educator, researcher, and gaming enthusiast dedicated to bringing game-inspired strategies into the classroom and helping families navigate the complexities of screen time. They are the author of the best-selling book, Power On, Managing Screen Time to Benefit the Whole Family, and the founder of The Gamer Educator, a platform where they share practical ways to manage screen time that work for both parents and kids. Thank you both for being here tonight. Skye, will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Annalisa. Appreciate that. Welcome, Ash.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so lovely to be here.
Well, we're going to get right into it as soon as I do the land acknowledgement, which is customary for Los Angeles County. The County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tuktaviam, Serrano, Quiche, and Chumash people. We honor and pay respects to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, and reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and local tribal governments, including, and in no particular order, the Fernandino Tuktaviam Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California Tribal Council, Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians, Quiche Nation, Yohataviam of San Manuel Nation, San Fernando Band of Mission Indians, Coastal Band of Chumash Nations, and the Gabrielino Tongva Nation Gabrielino Tongva Tribe. Okay, well, we've been waiting for this. You're our first guest of the year.
Oh, how exciting.
And, you know, I think for a lot of us who are either our parents or aunties or uncles or caregivers or educators, we're on the heels of a fairly long winter break where I'm sure most of us just gave the devices to the kids just so that we could survive. And now I think many of us are now trying to get back to some sort of order and rules and regulations around the devices and games. So I think this conversation is timely. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely. This is also a time where we tend to, if you gave a kid a Switch or a Switch 2 over the break for a gift, and now, right about now, you might be like thinking, what did I do?
Did
What
I,
have I
what
done?
did I do?
Right.
I'll be really honest with you, Ash. I thought about getting one each year. In fact, I have a teenager, a tween. I have a tween. And each year I think about like that switch thing or one of the PS, whatever number they're on, 5 or 6.
Mhm.
And each year I don't do it. And every year after the holiday, I'm like, yes, I got away with not
One more.
giving in. But there's this whole other world that we will talk about beyond the devices per se on the internet. So I'd love to get your thoughts here. Let's just sort of orient this conversation with 2 questions. One, how did you get interested and involved in this issue and research around screen time and video games? Let's start there.
Yeah, well, it came about really organically. Basically, I entered into my adulthood. Specifically, I was working as an educator and I was doing my master's degree in music education. And it just had not occurred to me that I had a different way of viewing these things than other people, right? You don't always quite realize that until it kind of comes up in contrast to someone else. And at the time, this was like 2010. So this was sort of the peak like rock band guitar hero era in a lot of video games. And the way those games teach you to play is actually quite similar to some of the pedagogical methods that are used by like string teachers for beginning orchestra students. And so at the time I thought like, oh, this is such an interesting thing. Like what a dry idea, like string pedagogy. And now it's become so approachable. I bet there's teachers who are really taking advantage of this. And so I decided to see what I could find that existed in the research and found absolutely nothing. And which doesn't mean it wasn't happening, but it was not being written about in the way I expected. And when I did find anything just about sort of use of more commercial or entertainment based games in the classroom or taking ideas from them, what I found was that really there was very little, or it was written as if teachers would be completely unaware of these things. Like, what is a Nintendo Wii? Very hands off. And I thought, okay, this is not how I thought this was going to go. And so I decided to just start experimenting with things. And I experimented more with bringing in more of the structure of games so that it could feel more game like as opposed to like bringing a console into the room. And I really liked it. And I think a huge reason that I was able to do that, which is also a idea that informs a lot of my work now, is that I just grew up thinking of video games as just another part of my life. They were, in terms of their morality, they were equivalent to when I played outside or when I read a book or when I practiced the violin or when I walked the dog. And it was just another aspect of my life. And so I was able to think about them with the same kind of neutrality that I would in other things. And I think that really informed my perspective bringing into the classroom and then in pivoting into the world that I am in now, working more with families.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for folks who are intrigued by this conversation but don't know who you are. Who are you? What is your research, and kind of familiarize yourself with people.
Thank you. I appreciate that opportunity. So, my name is Ash Brandin, and I work as a middle school teacher, and I am a librarian. So, I am even more happy to be here with you all. I'm in my 4th year as a librarian at middle school level, but as you could tell from what I said earlier, I began as a music educator, did that for the first 6 years of my career, and then taught kind of a variety of subjects in middle school, math, social studies, went and got my admin license and decided that was not for me. And so now I'm very happy in the library. But when I was working around these ideas in the classroom, I was able to talk about them in some public spaces, mostly in like gaming affiliated spaces, because they were a bit more open to this idea than more traditional educational spaces. And then when we'd been in sort of our first or second year of COVID, I thought, I'm not going to be returning to an in person thing for a while. So, how do I kind of scratch this itch? And that was sort of the impetus that drove me into finally dip my toes into social media. And where I got an initial hold in a community was through homeschool families, and many more families were homeschool families in 2021 than now. But a lot of those families were bridging this gap between home and school environments. And I really had not thought about talking to caregivers in home environments because naively I thought, well, if they're allowing these things, then they must already see the validity in these things. And I was very wrong about that. And so pretty quickly I realized that my audience was not educators. My audience was often caregivers or people kind of straddling this in between. So since 2021, I've been using my Instagram page, which is The Gamer Educator, to honestly apply a lot of best pedagogical practice, like a lot of classroom management, a lot of educational practice or ideas that come from educational psychology, and just sort of taking that and taking my kind of neutral view of technology, of viewing it as something that can be part of our life without being the center of our lives, and merging them together so that I can hopefully help families find a way of making their family's relationship with technology and screens feel sustainable.
I like that. And so, of course, as I said, I have a tween now, but in 2021, she was very small. And so you remind me, it's like such a trauma response right now, but generally speaking, and she's an only child. And what we learned in that time of learning to, are you a parent? First, let me ask that question. Okay, how
I
old is your
am,
child?
yes. I have a 9-year-old child.
Okay, so in and a single child.
Yes.
Yes, in and around the same situation. In 2021, at the height of the pandemic, when everyone was inside, there was this moment. And so, of course, my child had an iPad, but, it was really regulated at the time and trying to, like, then transition to this moment where we had to use that device, in this case, an iPad, for instruction with the teacher. But something really interesting happened for her and for me, something that I was not prepared for, but that is sustained today, which is she and her friends at 5 years old, Ash, began to use the iPad in a way that, like, they would FaceTime each other and live talk to each other while playing the game. And so that moment, I want to get into that in our questions, really opened my eyes, because I was like, no devices, it's going to rot your brain, blah, 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 all the things. But then they were actually playing like we would do when we were children, like hide and seek. Like she would run around the house and literally play hide and seek with her friend, like, but virtually, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that must have been such an interesting thing to see kind of happen organically in front of you. And a good challenge to then be open to it. It's funny that you bring up something happening in that kind of COVID era that was kind of a transformative or pivotal moment for you, because as I talk about at the beginning of my book that came out last year, sorry, I haven't had to refer to it recently, but that was a very pivotal time for me as well, where I
Mm-hmm.
was teaching seventh grade social studies at the time. And so I was trying to synchronously teach like 30, 13-year olds. And meanwhile, I
Oh
have like a
boy.
newly turned 3-year old at home. And my spouse was already working at home, but it was not a job that could be stopped and started. So we had agreed that I was going to be the one like trying to do both these things. And I had set them up with this sort of like, probably saw it on Instagram, like a toddler activity where they were gonna like get Easter eggs out of a bin with a big spoon, and then in each one I had like put in a jelly bean, which also says a lot that like I wouldn't give them an iPad for 30 minutes, but instead I would give them like 50 jelly beans hidden in eggs, right? That says a lot right there. And it was probably like, I mean, generously, I'm going to say maybe 15 seconds into me first trying to teach a class before my child, loudly off screen is like, Muffin, my parent name is Muffin, Muffin, I found a jelly bean. And I'm like, what? I'm panicking, right? Because I'm thinking like you're supposed to be quiet, and of course now looking back, I'm like, what was I
Yeah.
expecting? My students are getting flustered. I'm getting flustered. I'm losing control of the classroom, which is like every teacher's nightmare. My 3-year-old, I'm getting like snappy with, but also it's like my 3-year-old's being a 3-year-old in their own home, right? Like they're not doing
Yeah.
anything unreasonable, and after a minute or two of trying to make this work, I heard my spouse like open the office door and basically like ran into the room, like threw a tablet and headphones at my child, ran back out. And my first thought was like, I failed. There's this first feeling of like, oh no, right? I shouldn't have to use that. I should have found another way. But then I realized, okay, but the other adult at our house didn't feel one iota of guilt about this. It was like, we need to get these things done. This is a way to get these things done. And from that day on, my kiddo had at that time, like 30 minutes of some tablet time right before lunch. And that was like, I became just a wonderful regular part of our day where some days I was using it to make lunch and some days I was teaching and some days I was taking a shower and some days I was
Yep.
like taking a break to just not have to be needed. And it became such a regular and expected part of our day that really worked for all of us. And that was such an important moment for me and my own approach to these things. It just goes to show how like, we all deal with this, right? It's hard.
That's right. And so, thinking about your research, and if you could just share with this audience a little bit in that moment where you and your spouse learned that there was effectively a trifecta, a tag team between the two of you and the device and the child, right? To manage the
Absolutely.
child.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. Like I was having these flashbacks of like, I'm at home right now, so there's a wall behind me. But before I got savvy with the screen background, she would be doing flips in the back of it, because she, at the time, she was 5, and that's what 5-year-olds do. And so I effectively turned my desk so that I have a wall behind me so that I could, manage being at home and being working from home at that time. And I share that with you because as the child is just being a child and you and your partner are learning to navigate this new world of trying to work and teach and parent and be creative, how does your research kind of evolve out of that time? So you talked about it a little bit, but I want to kind of tease out, like, how did that become the thing?
That's a great question. And I want to be clear here that, I am not like an academic researcher. Like I did not pursue that. So although I have
I
done
did,
some,
and you didn't miss anything.
I did all but a dissertation. I did all the coursework, but I didn't get my EDD. Some days I regret it, and then most of the time I don't. So,
Well,
but
it sounds to me that you are a public scholar, which I think there's space for both an academic and a public scholar.
well, I appreciate that reframe. In some of my graduate work, I did some informal research within my own classroom. But in terms of what I do now, it's often applying a lot of the things that I would have learned in other parts of my life and then finding ways to apply them here. And oftentimes it's also reconciling what we might see in terms of the research that exists out in the world, because that, any caregiver knows, is extremely overwhelming. Where if you feel like, oh, I want to see what the best practice is, what do they say I should be doing, and then you start to look
The
and then you
experts.
realize exactly, and then you realize that like half of it contradicts itself, and that when you really try to start to make sense of it, then suddenly you think like, oh my god, I can't do anything, right? And then you feel
Hmm.
kind of like paralyzed, and
And
then it's
then you
like,
had an impasse. That's right.
right. And now, like, what do I do?
Catatonic.
Can I shut
Hmm.
the door and actually just ignore it to begin with?
Yeah.
Because, like, I don't know how to I wouldn't even know how to move forward. So, this was something that I address in my book. I have a chapter that's devoted to sort of just a review of the research to really get a sense of, like, what is it really saying? What is it really not? Because we often just hear kind of a top line of it. But when it comes to kind of figuring out like how do I reconcile all that I might hear and the sort of big body of the research, right? And how do I like reconcile that with my real life? Right? I think that that's a really important thing. And one of the things I think we have to think about is recognizing that, our families are not research laboratories, like we have to actually make this work in the long term. And if it's okay with you, I actually would love to read just a snippet that I wrote about this, because honestly, I think I'd be trying to paraphrase myself. I started this by calling it information should empower, not admonish. And I think that that's really important when we're trying to figure out how do I bring this in to my life, and especially for kids. When we encounter information, it's easy to immediately compare that information to whatever our current practice is. But if we are not able to implement a change based on that information, all that will happen is we will feel shame or guilt for not doing the right thing that a study or article says that we should. Focusing solely on data ignores that our homes and families are not research laboratories, but instead subjective environments, and we have to make screen time work for us. And I encourage people to think when they are approaching things like research or best practices to think like about one thing that you cannot really change. Like what is something you don't really have the ability to change right now? And as I said in this passage, maybe it's like I can't change that when we get home from school and I'm making dinner, I am the only adult at home. Like, I can't change that. Or I can't change that my kids are at an age where I can't just say, go play outside because they're under 3, or that's not a safe practice for them, or I don't live with proximity to safe access to the outdoors. So there's going to be something we can't change. In my household, like, I can't change that screen time often happens while I'm making dinner and is often largely independent, where like often my child is doing that independently. So if that's something I can't change, then it might actually serve me and my family better to maybe table that in terms of really paying attention to what I might be encountering in terms of the research until that's something that is within my control. Because if I were to suddenly read a study that says, well, the worst screen time your kid could have is independent, but that's currently like the need that a screen is helping meet in my household, then what is going to happen, right? Like, all it's going to happen is I'm going to feel worse. No one's going to come over to be present with my child, right? I'm not going to have that inequity suddenly met in a different way. I'm just going to feel bad about the way I currently am meeting it because that's what I have available.
I was actually going to get into that into the next question, like all the conflicting research. And basically, what I heard you say is that you did a literature review. So it sounds like you're already
Essentially.
halfway to your PhD, anyhow. And a lot of it conflicts itself, right? Because,
Yes.
the vantage point and what they are researching. And my question was going to be is what do we do with all of that? But you're kind of answering it right now. And something that you're bringing up that I hadn't thought of in its entirety is the privilege conversation.
Oh,
So when you think about this world of these, researchers, like who are they talking to? Are they talking to upper middle class people? Are they talking to working parents? They're talking to parents who have 2 or 3 jobs and who rely upon this technology to help manage their lives and their children. Like there's so many nuances and so many different ways to view this research that I think is missing sometimes, right? Like, who in what world can a parent who has 2.5 jobs and 3 kids only allot 15 minutes a day on, how does that
right.
person manage life?
Right. And I think that a lot of it gets very interwoven very quickly, in that if you start to kind of peel that apart and pull at that thread, suddenly we get to a much more nuanced and I think potentially powerful conversation, but also a lot messier conversation. It is simple. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is simple to say screens are the problem. Don't let them have them. Just have them less. It's easy to kind of lump everything over there because, I mean, let's be honest, screens, like, this is a screen, right? But that's
Right.
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 Screens is like, that's so amorphous. So it's easy to lump stuff in there. But all that really is saying to the caregiver is, and I really dislike this framing, is it kind of implies that the caregiver is the barrier, right? That the caregiver is the problem.
Yes. Yes.
And I think
Without
that's
getting into
such
the nuance of real life, real
right,
scenarios
right,
and real barriers to success, right? Like
right,
managing your child and what's
right.
happening.
And I find that just to be such an uncharitable framing. And it also assumes too that there's a barrier of ignorance, that like, oh, all we have to do is tell parents that these are bad and then they'll stop. And I'm like, I'm sorry, did you think parents were doing this because they thought it was good? Because I
Yeah,
have not met a parent who has been
that's
like,
right.
"What? It's not the best thing I could be doing." Like, I have not yet
Give it
met
to them
that parent.
6 hours a day, right?
Right?
Like
Right.
most of us have a tremendous amount of guilt,
Oh,
especially those of us
incredible.
who are in information and education, because we know the research, we hear it
Right.
all the time. And
Right.
then I know for myself, back at that point in time, I had a tremendous amount of guilt, Ash. It's like, oh my God, I'm turning into the worst parent, but what can I do when I work 12 hours a day? When we're
Right.
all at home, when we have one big room because we didn't buy a house thinking that we needed offices.
Mm-hmm.
Things,
Right.
things
Same.
sort of life things. And so you manage. And I think that's really what I hear the takeaway from our question is like, what do you do with the research? You manage it based on what your needs are.
Right. And what you can control. Right. And if there is something that is currently concerning you, right? Like, you're worried about something you are noticing, or if there is something that is within your control, if you could have reasonable control over an amount of time within 1 to 2 hours and you're like, I could probably get it down to 45 minutes to an hour and a half, right? Like,
Mhm.
what is within your control? And then maybe look at the best practice within that. Or if
Mhm.
you decide, like, I'm going to look at what the best practice is in terms of the delivery of the content, or if we can play content together versus not. Okay, what's within your control?
One of the things that we learn to do, well, we live in Los Angeles. I'm not sure where you're located. Are you on the East Coast, West Coast?
I'm in Colorado. I'm
Okay,
right in the
so a
middle.
little
Yeah.
bit different, but here it takes an hour to get 3 miles. I
Yeah.
exaggerate not.
But we're
And so
driving all the
one of the
time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that we learn to negotiate in terms of screen time is listening to audiobooks when she was really little and the stories. And so we're in the car all listening together, trying to kind of rethink this tool, because really the screen is a tool, and
Mhm.
how to like manipulate it to work for us. So let's talk about a couple of the myths. And one of the things that we really appreciated about your work is that you do attempt to dispel some of the myths around screen time and devices with teens specifically. What was your finding?
I think what's really important is to just recognize that most of the time, if we're hearing a headline that seems like very oversimplified, right, that there's probably some missing nuance there. Like there's probably some missing nuance. And one of the studies that I really like because of kind of the nuance that was in it, ironically, ended up getting also cited and talked about from a very different perspective in The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And without getting too much into that, I just thought it was interesting that we both kind of were very focused on one particular study, and it was a large cohort. There were a couple similar ones, but one was a very large cohort. We're talking about like over 50,000 youth that were involved, and looking at sort of the relationship between certain parts of their life and potentially negative outcomes, mostly negative mental health outcomes. And what I found really interesting in part was that this study looked both at the amount of time that would require impact, but they also did a similar study around that time that looked at what they called minimally important difference, which was like the amount of time that it would take before an adult in this child's life would actually notice a difference. So, not just statistical significance, but actual, like when you would notice, or the more subjective amount. And I thought that was really interesting because we see statistical significance and it sounds really big and scary, but often is actually very minute in its measurability. So they found that the amount of time that it would take for an adult in a child's life to actually notice a difference in their child's behavior was around just under about 5 hours of screen time per day on average, was how much it would take before the adults at home were actually starting to notice a negative impact. And that was a very different number
Okay,
than
so
with,
I was going to ask you, because first you said notice the difference, and I was going to ask you to tease that out. So negative impact. Can you give examples that the research provided?
off the top of my head, I can't. It was through a questionnaire that they had the adults fill out. Uh,
Because I can tell you from my point of view, my child gets highly aggro if she's been on
oh,
too long,
yeah,
and snappy and like
yeah.
unreasonable. So I was
Yeah.
just
Well,
curious
and what's
about.
interesting is there's totally going to be families listening to this right now. They're like, 5 hours. My kid would be like that after 20 minutes. And the answer is, yeah, certain content is going to affect people different. I'm like that after a certain amount of time in certain circumstances, right? So that I think is ironically, even though it's a statistic that might alleviate some guilt, it also just goes to show how the research on its own, right, is sometimes not enough, because we can hear that one statistic and go like, okay, but my kid might react like that after like 45 minutes if they are, watching YouTube videos, or if they were playing a certain game that really amps them up, they're going to be throwing the controller after half an hour. So what does that mean? Is my kid, damn it, right? It's very easy to start like spiraling. And sometimes the simplest answer is like, then maybe that thing is not the best fit. But if that's the thing your kid loves, one of the things I talk about a lot on my page is like, how do we make this sustainable, right? If I
Mhm.
know that that certain game is going to amp my kid up, and after this is bedtime, then maybe I don't allow that thing right now at bedtime. But that doesn't mean I have to
Yeah,
say no to it forever in every condition in perpetuity,
that's
right? And
right.
that's a good thing too for kids to learn, is because our kids are not going to grow up into a world without technology. Like, we can't really unring this bell of technological ubiquity. So we probably don't want kids who are like abstinent of technology. It's just not really possible. What we probably want is kids who can manage technology in their life sustainably. And that is much more possible if we are also willing to kind of get into that messiness and model that with them and go like,
Hmm.
okay, we have to be out the door in 15 minutes. Should we be playing something or watching something that has a finite end time, or something that can go on and on? Well, if we have to get out the door in 15 minutes, or our whole morning, like domino effects to heck, then yeah, probably we need to be watching the thing with a finite end. And
Hmm.
that's a sustainable skill. Like, I need my kid to be able to manage their time, whether it's dealing with screens or dealing with something else. But if all we think is like amount of time, that's all that matters, or they're acting this way, it must be the screen is bad, like, we kind of miss a lot of that nuance.
That's right. And we're going to talk a little bit about, games, video games, as I interpret it, opposed to short form, because I do think there's some differences there, but I'll get that to that. One of the things that I have had to incorporate in our challenge with navigating technology, Ash, is that at this point in time, she's 11. I physically have to go take the phone away in the morning and say, we're going to put this down, or take them out of the room. And I'll talk about all the things that I have done, and would love to hear your thoughts around the ways that we navigate time and negotiate like time. For instance, our kid cannot have any of her devices unless it's homework during the weekday, right? We are at a point, I'll tell you, she just did a presentation literally yesterday, a PowerPoint presentation about why she thinks she should be able to have her devices at least 1 hour a day. And she convinced us. So we're going to do it. We're going to do a test, but I'll get there in a
Good
minute.
for her.
Yeah, it was really quite incredible. My partner and I were both like jaw dropped, like, really? It was so well thought out. I'll even send it to you if I can.
Oh, please. Yeah.
um, Moving to our next question, in and around the similar through line to the previous question, what piece of information or research do you think doesn't get enough attention? Like, we all know, quote, all this stuff that we're all doing it wrong. Okay, fine.
Right.
But what
Yeah.
do you think we should be hearing more about that we're not talking about, or there's not enough research
Yeah.
to support it?
Yeah. Most of the time, even the studies that are like giving us this sort of, doom and gloom, oh no, it's bad, the vast, vast, vast majority of them, the negative outcomes are most of the time in excessive users. And most of the time, that is people who are like in excess of, depending on the study, 2, 3, or 4 hours or more per day. And specifically, one thing I think is a very interesting piece of research that often surprises people is specifically looking at teens and negative mental health outcomes, specifically suicide ideation. The groups that have the worst outcomes are one of two groups, depending on the study. They sort of flip flop, worst and second worst. One of those groups is excessive users of 4 or more hours per day. The other group are never users, meaning people who do not play video games at all. And that, I think, often surprises people, but it actually speaks to more of the psychological reality, which is that often, if we're seeing excessive use, sometimes that's more an indication of a psychological need that is being unmet in that person's life. And that, so the problem is not necessarily they're playing video games all the time. The problem may be they don't have another way of meeting that need, or they are alone, or they are lonely. But I think it's very interesting to see that the groups that tend to have the best outcomes are moderate users, which in these specific studies are users between 1 and 4 hours a day, which 3 hours a day is a lot, right? But in terms of what they were looking at in these studies, those were the groups that had the best outcomes. One more thing I just want to make sure that I mention is a recent study, I think from 2023, from The Ohio State University, that found, and I'm going to quote my summary of it and then quote the researchers real quick. It was a study of children living in low income homes preparing to enter kindergarten. And the study found that screen time was not significantly associated with negative impacts on their academic skills or their social skills. And the researchers spoke to the systemic inequity piece, which is often just missing in these studies. And I was so glad they spoke to it. So I just want to make sure I include what they had to say. And they said, quote, lower income and minority households often face a lot of obstacles that make it more difficult to limit screen time. These results can help reassure parents that low to moderate levels of screen time don't seem to matter as much as they may think. Yes, parents should monitor screen time, but there are so many other bigger problems that low income families are facing. We need to move toward more evidence based efforts to reduce the barriers to their children associated with living in poverty. End quote. And I think that's so true. If we really think that there's like a over reliance on technology, then we need to be targeting the systemic inequities that are necessitating that over reliance in the first place. Right. But that's
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 right.
a
And
much more
that was
complicated than
somewhat of what I was alluding to. It's like, don't talk to me. I don't want to hear about how you think 2 hours is too much screen time. Let's talk about why the 2 hours are
right.
needed from the
Right.
parent's perspective. Or, and that I think is consistent across all social ailments that we're managing and that we see come through the public library, see through the families who utilize the library, where, sometimes you get that kid who literally comes in at 2:30 after school and they are there until 6 p.m. when you close or 8 p.m. when you're closed because there is nowhere else for that kid to go. And I think libraries do a good job at offering not only technology and screens, but other things for the kids to do, really affecting that sort of what we used to call a New York boost, which is best out of school time, right? Like really like having programming to those kids in some ways so that they have a variety of interactions and real life interactions, right? So this was a little bit of a long question, so I'm going to try to read it verbatim because I will likely screw it up if I try to short form it too quickly, edit it in real time. So you read a lot about video games and watchable entertainment like television as kinds of content that kids are exposed to on screens and the different ways in which we can help kids have positive, healthy relationships, this kind of content. But sometimes it seems like this conversation is a one side of the screen issue rather than both sides, of which we're trying to get into and navigate. Social media short form content like TikTok are also huge parts of the kids' diet, mine included, despite the fact that I don't want her to be on there. How do some of your guidelines apply to social media? And do we need to approach this kind of content from a different angle? And I think this is important, Ash, because as they get older, tween over here, she's classically female, right? So she's much more interested in TikTok and face videos and facial products and whatever than videos like Fortnite. Like, I mean, that's also here as well. So what are your thoughts and what did your research produce out of these questions?
So this might seem like I am dodging this question. I promise I am not. This is my favorite framing for this. The thing that I end up saying the most when people are asking a question that feels like what we're talking about is technology, and I would argue that actually we are not. And so what I tend to say is, in this situation, take the technology out of it. And I know you're thinking like, that's impossible because we're talking about social media. So when parents are saying like, well, when should they get a phone? When should they be on social media? I would say, okay, stop thinking about tech. And I'd like you to instead think about pools. Stay with me here. So
I'm
pools,
following. Okay.
okay, pools are inherently dangerous, right? Like we do not know how to swim from birth. So we, because pools are dangerous and because we know that pools and bodies of water will be a part of our child's life and can enrich their lives, we purposefully make
Yes.
sure that we expose our kids to a pool. However, We don't throw them in, right? But we do it in a developmentally appropriate way. And along the way, we are shielding them from the dangers that they cannot currently keep themselves safe from, while teaching them the skills that they are ready for to keep themselves safe in the way they can currently handle. Right. So when they're an infant,
Via
oh, go ahead.
training and guardrails. So this is what I hear,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And
Right.
pool fences, if we're going to continue down this analogy, right? Like
Right.
the
There are things I'm going to
scaffolding.
shield. Yes, it's exactly scaffolding. There are things I'm going to shield my child from because it would be irresponsible for me to put the weight of that on them right now, right? Like if I have a toddler, yes, I should have a pool fence if I have a pool in my backyard. If I'm going to be in the pool with them. They're going to be within arm's reach. They're going to wear a life vest, etc.
And we're going to
And
get them swim lessons.
we're going to get them swim lessons. And then, as they develop more skill, then they're not in my arms anymore, but I'm still in the pool. And then one day I'm sitting on the side of the pool. I mean, continue
Yeah,
down this line.
yeah,
You understand what I'm saying. But
yeah,
even when,
absolutely.
my child is 9, when we are in the open ocean, even if my child were 18, even if my child were a competitive athletic swimmer, I would
Yeah.
still be showing them, here is the lifeguard station, this is a rip current, right? Like there are things that no amount of preparation or, academic preparation is going to keep them safe from. There are things we all have to be aware of to keep ourselves safe in a body of water. And that's going to be
Mm-hmm.
true for anything, for a car, for a bike, for technology. And so when I think of it that way, I think, okay, what is a skill that my child is currently ready for? And what is a danger of this thing that they are not yet ready to take on that I do need to shield them from? And that can still feel really abstract when we're talking about social media. But if that does, think about like, okay, what are you afraid of? And if I were to
Mm-hmm.
list out the things that might scare me, maybe I land on something like I'm worried that they might, get preyed upon by someone. Okay. That actually is something to be worried about across many things, right? Not just social media. So how do I make sure my child knows whether or not someone is safe? How do I give them the skill of knowing what information is private and what information can be shared publicly? And that will help them when they're in person talking to someone, when they're meeting strangers, when they are also
Mm-hmm.
navigating being online. So sometimes it helps me frame it because it helps me see through to like the skill that might need more addressing and also the things that might need more of my prevention or my
And
shielding.
and you know when the way that you respond, first of all, when you said pools, I got you immediately. As a swimmer, as a person with the pool, as a person with the pool with the young child, these were all the things that we talked about like early on, like how are we going to manage, can she be outside by herself, all the stuff. But then the way that you frame it is, I think, a really good frame. We do this for every part of their lives. Walking down the street, do at what age do you let them go outside by themselves? At what age how do you teach them stranger danger? It's all the same thing. It's just a different avenue that we're having to address via the, so I think that's actually a really good response, and I don't feel like you dodged it at all. I actually
Okay,
thought
good.
you brought that home very well.
May I add one very short thing?
Yes, absolutely.
Which is just that one of the things I advocate for a lot that I think can feel difficult to people is that I'm often advocating for this sense of moral neutrality. And that doesn't mean that I am saying that there's nothing potentially wrong or dangerous with something like social media or technology, but it's more that if I'm always sort of judgmental or thinking derisively or negatively about screens, video games, etc., I am often going to miss these kinds of opportunities. Because if I'm
Mm-hmm.
resentful of it or I am feeling guilty about it, I'm not going to view that thing as something that I can base skills around because I kind of am thinking that it's bad all the time. So the
Mm-hmm.
neutrality is often just looking for these avenues because we want to build up these digital safety and literacy skills. We understand how important they are. And the reality is, as you said, we're building up these skills all the time: risk
Mm-hmm.
assessment and critical thinking and when and how to ask for help. I mean, these are skills that apply across all parts of their lives. And so if I'm already talking to them about how do I know whether or not I can approach a stranger in real life, well, there you go. And now let's talk
Mhm,
about how that would apply online. And
mhm.
it can be really organic that way. So oftentimes it's stuff that we are doing. It's just recognizing that we just need to fill in some of those gaps and just make it clear to kids how this apply in different parts of their lives.
I think about bringing it back to our work as librarians and, challenging text and censorship and what that means. And when your child is met with issues or subjects that are challenging, that ones that you don't agree on, what do you do? Do you automatically go to that library and say, you need to get this out of the library, or do you take that opportunity to talk to your child about why this is appropriate or why it isn't appropriate, and why you, as the parent, as the person in charge, are putting guardrails around this topic for a later date? And so, this thinking about it through the lens of librarianship, I also feel like it's easier to kind of understand where the parental friction needs to come in, and we cannot rely upon technology and technology companies to do this work. Like, we have to do it. That said, I will say during this last 5 years, I feel it's been very promising, some of the guardrails that technology has put around this. Like, for instance, whenever I've done all the stuff, my kid has to ask for permission. It comes to both of our phones, and so we have much more interaction and control over what she sees. And then there's the negotiation and conversation about when she feels it's appropriate to have more access. But again, that is my responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the librarian or the technologist. I want to make sure I get to a couple of the questions here, but before I go, I need to ask you this question, Ash. I ask this of everyone who joins us. What are you reading right now?
Ooh. Okay, I have them near me. Okay, my neighborhood free little library the other day, I went by and of all things, I was so surprised. I had a copy of Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks, and I have read many
Oh,
parts of that book,
yes.
but
I
I don't
haven't read
actually
that since
own.
college, but yes.
Yes, I read, yes. And when I was getting my librarian certification, I read quite a bit of it, but I didn't actually own a copy. And so I was like, this is a sign. But my more for fun reading one is my friends and fellow creator online and former educator, Laura Danger, her book, No More Mediocre, which I'm just going to hold up, which is about domestic equity in partnerships, came out just a
Oh,
couple of weeks ago and is a
okay.
very research-based book about domestic labor and domestic equity
Hmm.
in partnership.
Hmm.
And the other that I'm just enjoying, which was a Christmas present, is This Way Up: When Maps Go Wrong and Why It Matters. And it is by Mark Cooper Jones and Jay Foreman. And they run a wonderful YouTube channel called Map Men. And they are hilarious and they just care a whole lot about maps and geography. And so it's a book about incorrect maps in history. It's very interesting.
Love that. Wow. So you're a triple reader too. I read several things at once and I rarely finish
Yeah,
any of them.
exactly.
But I
And it just
always
slows
have
me down.
goals.
hmm It's like whatever's
Okay,
nearby. Yeah.
we're gonna put those items in the chat for people who are interested. I'll go ahead and ask one of my last questions. And I think we kind of covered this, but this is more for the families who have several different ages, right? Because, time is appropriate for different ages.
Right.
What are some of the suggestions you have for navigating screen time and content consumption when there are different age children and youth in the house and different developmental stages?
One of the framings I have at the end of my book is around like really putting boundaries into place around screen time. An acronym I use is NICE. And I think the first letter of that, the N, is the most important because it stands for need. And we kind of talked about this earlier, but often it's asking, like, well, what is the need? Because if the need is like, I feel as a parent some guilt or pressure to like give my kids all equal or appropriate access to screens, but that's just going to make my life harder, then like, instead, how can we make it so that my needs also are part of the conversation, and
Mm,
are also being met. So like, what is the need? Maybe the family need is just like some downtime, and that could be it. And it could also be time where I'm catching up on something, for example. So
that's right.
thinking about how we frame it in a way that is allowing for all of us to be part of that consideration. And I won't go through all parts of it, but the next step in that acronym is input. And I think anytime that we can involve our children in giving, age or developmentally appropriate input, even if it is as simple as I have a young child, for example, and I'm going to say like, you can watch show A or show B, but they get to choose between them. I mean, you'd be amazed how much sense of autonomy that can give a child of just feeling like, oh, I get to be part of this. And I think involving kids in that and showing them that like they do not just get to contribute, but like they're part of the community that we're building and that we're trying to make sure that these things are going to work for all of us, I think can be
Mm,
really important. And so if we're thinking like, how do we make this work for everybody because they don't want to play the same thing or it's using the same device, a strategy I love from Faber and King, who wrote How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen. They have a strategy they call the family meeting strategy. And it's sort of like just laying out the problem. Like, what is the problem? And really listening openly to everyone's potential solutions and not discounting any of them and like just kind of laying all of them out on the table and kind of going through them one by one and being willing to try them and really just seeing kind of some equity in like the thoughts and opinions of kind of all members of the household. And I used to
mhm,
balk at that. And then when I tried it with my kiddo, even when they were really young, like 3 or 4,
mhm.
their suggestion ended up being the thing that worked for all of us. And I was
I think it's
just
called
like, oh,
participatory
well,
governance. Yes.
ah, I love, yes, it makes a ton of sense when
Yeah,
you say it like
yeah,
that. But yeah, I mean, everyone wants to feel heard, right? So like,
yeah.
think about what need do we ultimately need to be like what is going to work for all of us in terms of a need, and then how do we make it so this is something that everybody can contribute to, and then making sure it's something that we can actually stick by, right? Like, is this
Mhm.
actually going to be sustainable? Because if so, then it's more likely to work, and if not, then we're probably going to be arguing about it again. So and then seeing how it goes and knowing that like if it suddenly blows up and it doesn't work, that's not like an indictment of you. Like it's
You
not,
have
it
the
just
right to change and pivot
right,
as parents
right,
and as families. Absolutely.
right.
Nothing is finite. Here's a great question that we hear all the time, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it because I have my own thoughts. What age do you think is a good age for kids to have cell phones?
Honestly, I'm gonna kind of go back to my pool analogy here, but age is like very simple. But I really don't like to focus on age because I think what people are actually asking is readiness. And readiness is a very different thing than age. And when we hear things like wait until eighth or delay social media until 16, it's like, well, there, no magic switch is flipping when they're in
No.
the eighth grade or when they're 16 that is going to magically just give them the skills to navigate this. So I mean, honestly, feels like a non-answer, but it's an age at which you feel like this is maybe a time or an inevitability in which this is a skill that they can begin to build. I mean,
Yeah.
I am an elder millennial, so for me, like my first cell phone was when I was driving, and it was very practical, right? Like I was not always home. People needed to reach me. They needed to know if I was safe.
I wanted to add to this because I think this is an important distinction that you bring up that was a critical point for us in our family. And this is for Lorraine. I don't know, Lorraine, if you're in California, but it occurred to me, it hit me like a ton of bricks about 2 years ago that we don't have a home phone. And our phones are now, you can only access the adult phones by having the right face, right? So there's no way to unlock. So there's no way when I realized there was no way for my kid to have to call for an emergency. We have all the emergency numbers, but then she didn't have any access because she didn't have a phone because there are no home phones. It really helped me change, like Ash is saying, how I looked at this phone as a tool rather than a barrier and something that we have to restrict. And then, so of course, we went on to restrict it down to only text and only being able to have the numbers in the phone. Like there are things parents can do to put scaffolding around this.
Right.
But, I think Ash is onto something. It really does depend on what the use is and how well you're teaching this child. Let me get to a
And
couple of these other questions here, Ash. I don't know if you can see them, but there are quite a few. They're rolling in now.
okay.
So Katie says, thanks. Can you address helping teens from being distracted on school issue devices?
Yeah.
Okay, take a
Yeah.
deep breath.
I know. Seriously. With my teacher hat on. Yeah. So this is one of those things where you can only control what you can control, right? Like when they're at school, they're not really within our control in the same way. So if your child's school utilizes a management program for technology, Go Guardian is a popular one, Securely is another popular one. Those are tools that can be used by school staff or teachers to monitor or restrict what a student can do on a device. So, depending on the age of your student, et cetera, it might be worth asking if that's something that is available or if teachers have access to it or if it's something that could be implemented. And if that's something that potentially is already happening, might also be a conversation to have with your teen to maybe try to identify like what the potential need is that is maybe prompting this. Like, is it boredom? Is it impulsivity? Is it who knows what, is just distraction or just, the allure of like the entire open internet? Why would that not be appealing? Of course, like we can't really be surprised when this happens to kids, but finding maybe some potential solutions for them. And even if it's, I would say, approaching the teacher also with a sense of like partnership, of figuring out like how can we find a solution together, because we all want to be on the same team here, right? Like, so
Mhm.
what are some things that we could try that feel sustainable in the classroom but that we could also support at home? Like in the classroom, I will sometimes have students where if I'm having to play whack-a-mole all the time with their computer with management software, then I just say like, you just get to sit next to me so that I can just be right here and see your computer. We can just do that. That's
Yeah,
fine. Or I can print it out. Yeah.
and I think Ash is onto something. Like, first of all, the school that my kid goes to, they take all the phones and you have to put them in one of those little lock bags until the end of the day or till lunchtime at least. And then they have a managed network where there are only certain sites they can go to. And then I have my own actual managed software where if she's not on the pre-approved sites, she has to ask permission. So there's like it's a constant negotiation based on what I can see. I think this is a great question that we'll end with here. Ben says, my problem is that my kids have been raised in a non-authoritarian way, and I have no ability to enforce boundaries. That's already a problem, and I'm not even a psychotherapist, but we can talk about that. If I try, I'm the dad who has them the shorter period of time, I think is what he's saying. I am met with resistance and accusations about being controlling. I've heard that myself, Ben. My daughter has a phone, and the idea of taking it away is physically unreasonable. What can I do? I think this goes back to you, Ash, and back to the pool analogy somehow.
It does. And it sounds like there's, being in multiple households, which is also difficult because, you can only control what's within your control, and that is hard. And I don't want to act like that's not a really significant like layer here. So I make a lot of analogies to food, and I make a lot of comparisons with Ellen Satter's division of responsibility model when it comes to food. And put extremely simply, it is an adult decides when and what food is available in a meal, right? When we're eating and what's on the plate. And a child decides how much to eat of what's available, meaning that a child may eat, only the peas and the strawberries and one bite of bread. And that's their responsibility, right? And so we don't intervene with that. And that's more the model to try to kind of avoid some of the associations with food and eating that some of us are trying to undo now in our middle age. Speaking only for myself here. But when I think about how that applies to technology, I think it's often much the same. We decide what is available, like what can they access and when, and they can decide what to do within that content that's available. Like you've probably seen your kid do something seemingly nonsensical in a video game. And this part is extremely important. They also get to have feelings about it. And they are really, really good at that part of their job. Arguably, sometimes like too good. They've had a lot of practice at that part of their job. And that part really stinks Like there's times where sometimes I find myself looking around as a parent going like, who's the adult who's going to make this decision? And then I'm like, oh no, it's me. It's still me. Right? And that part
You
isn't
know,
fun.
I think I come from a different generation and maybe a different model, and I'll just share with you. I come from a generation where you're going to eat what I cook or you're not going to eat. And that's the negotiation. Either you can eat it or you cannot. But what you cannot do is have something different. So
Yeah.
I'm a little bit older than you. And I think it was honestly really effective. And I hear you with the negotiation. And this is part of this whole gentle parenting conversation that I think we should talk about at another point in time. But there are some boundaries that parents have to lay as parents, right? This is our job, right? Ash looked around, was like, "Oh yeah, that's me. That was me. I'm supposed to do that."
Right. But what's funny is
And
that
that's the hard
you're
thing. Sometimes you got to
right.
be the bad guy.
Right. And essentially what you're describing is the same model, right? It's like,
Yeah,
here's
it
what's for
is. No,
dinner. You don't
100.
have to eat it. Right. And that, yeah, and that's not easy. And kids, as much as they don't think they do, they love a boundary and they love knowing what the rules are because guess what? Their video games that they love, those are based on rules and those are based on boundaries. And if a video game stopped obeying its own rules, you would not play it. If every other time you jumped into the lava pit, you instead of dying, you got 1,000 lives, you'd be jumping in that lava pit every time, right? The game sticks to the rules, so you know how much freedom you have. And so I don't know if it's a helpful reframe, but like sometimes I have to be like, just be sturdy. Like I have to be boundaried like a game because then they know where their freedom lies. And unfortunately, it takes trial and error to figure that out.
Ash, it's been a pleasure having you
Hey,
here. Thank you so much for your insight. I think we've dropped Ash's book into the chat along with the other books that they recommend, or that I don't know if they recommend, but they are reading. Um,
I do.
and
Yes.
okay, okay, they do recommend. And we have really enjoyed this conversation. And with that, we thank everyone for joining us, and please have a great night.
Thank you so much.